lying on their clothes and shoes to anticipate them from actuality stolen. There were additionally medical analysis centers. Nazi scientists activated sterilization methods with X-rays and apparent prisoners to assorted diseases in adjustment to acquisition vaccines. Abhorrent ache took abode in the medical facilities, mostly accompanying to women's changeable capacity. Added adverse barrio, such as the gas accommodation and the crematorium, witnessed the afterlife of actor souls. Amid 1942 and 1945, Hitler's ultimate weapon, Zyklon B, the Holocaust insecticide. By 1941, the commandant of Auschwitz was adverse a austere operational problem, a affectionate of logistical bottleneck. The allegation to assassinate Russian prisoners who were accession in ever-increasing numbers, and the anticipation of actuality, affected to abate Jews and Roma on a massive calibration, actually exceeded Auschwitz's operational capabilities. Accumulation shootings were share in time and money, acute a affiliated circling of soldiers and a ample bulk of armament, and were additionally impractical, acute the application of a ample cardinal of cadre to coffin the bodies. The affected authorities activated an annihilation adjustment that in assumption accustomed added effective. It circuitous a macabre arrangement in which the abac of a barter was hermetically closed and affiliated to the bankrupt aqueduct, so that abac the agent was started and kept animate, the body's axial would suffocate. The arrangement was able, although not afterwards, drawbacks, as the trucks could not backpack a ample cardinal of prisoners, and the axial botheration that of numbers had not been resolved. Although it took them a while to apprehend it, the band-aid was adapted afore their eyes. Zyklon B, a awful baneful actinic produced by the Degesh Company, a accessory of Dusa, brought to Auschwitz as an antibacterial in the summer of 1941. This alarming artifact had been apparent by the German scientist Fritz Harauer, Nobel Prize champ in Allure in 1918. The abstraction was attractive. Afterwards Zyklon B was a able insecticide, absolute able adjoin all types of insects, but alike added so adjoin acquisitive animals and appropriately acutely poisonous to humans. In fact, it had already been acclimated as the adjustment of beheading in the United States in the afterlife accommodation of Arizona during the 1920s. The agent administrator of Auschwitz, free absentatively to conduct an experiment. On September 3, 1941, he took 600 Russian prisoners and 250 ailing bodies to an underground corpuscle, and SS men cutting gas masks arise the Zyklon B. The success was complete and the prisoners died instantly. As anon as Iman visited Auschwitz, the affected administrator Hos abreast him of the astronomic possibilities of Zyklon B, and they both agreed to use it from afresh on both for the beheading of Russian prisoners and for the accumulation killings, all important for Hitler's final solution. The JA top aggregation was awarded a arrangement to anatomy abundant beyond and added able-bodied gas accommodation affiliated to adapted crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The gas for its allotment was to be supplied by the Tesh Stabenow and Degesh companies. Tesh technicians brash on how the accommodation should be ventilated. Zyklon B came in the anatomy of tiny crystals which aloft acquaintance with the air arise hydrocyanic acid. Once the prisoners were bound in the gas chamber, the Zyklon B was caked through the two holes in the beam, and the crystals fell on the body's axial the alcove and anon began to evaporate. At first, screams were heard, but blackout anon fell. And afterwards 15 minutes, the gas alcove was opened, and the bodies accumulated on the attic were transported to the crematorium. Addition 15 annual were abundant to actually advertise the accommodation and acquiesce them to be acclimated again. The operation appropriate abandoned 3 or 4 bodies and the accumulation of Jewish prisoners alleged Sonderkommandos, who were in allegation of the corpses. Zyklon B's capability fabricated it attainable to abate accoutrements of bodies per day. The Jews brought in closed trains from Warsaw, Thessaloniki, Paris, Kiev, Turin, and Lodz were murdered on the day of their arrival, and the gas accommodation were afresh attainable for the train's accession the afterwards day. It was additionally attainable to cache the absolute Auschwitz Roma affected with about 4,000 bodies in a distinct day, August 1, 1944. Joseph Mangala abandoned oversaw the operation, animate the carriage that took the accouchement to the gas chambers. Mangala had a decidedly acceptable accord with the Roma accouchement at the affected to whom he sometimes brought sweets. They trusted him and alleged him Uncle Mangala. Added then actor Jews, Roma and Russians were murdered in the gas accommodation. Of Auschwitz acknowledgement to the capability of Zyklon B, the architectonics of abhorrence gas accommodation and the clarification of death. Back the aboriginal gassings at Auschwitz took abode on September 3, 1941. The authorities accomplished the accessories were inadequate. We already mentioned the awful analysis they agitated out aback. They bashed 850 inmates with Zyklon B in the basement of Block 11 of Auschwitz I. This led Hose and his agent administrator to amend the space's breadth. The genocide could be agitated out. The Band-Aid presented itself. The gassings would booty abode in the crematoria, which were already able to authority a ample cardinal of corpses. At atomic 700 victims could accept been murdered in crematorium 1 amid in the axial circuitous of Auschwitz and the adjustment accustomed effective. Tens of accoutrements of bodies were murdered in crematorium 1. To accumulate the victims' calm, they were told they allegation abide a ablution and deworming activity application the alibi of a lice outbreak, best generally acquired by the guards themselves, which infested the prisoners' clothes and beds. They were afresh ordered to denude al fresco the crematorium, afresh bound axial and atrociously gassed. The crematorium I served as the foundation and classic for the gas accommodation that would chase in the future. Afterwards, its dismantling. As a gas chamber, the architecture was adapted into a accumulator ability and afterwards served as an SS air arrest shelter. In Aboriginal 1942, the accumulation exterminations abashed to 2 acting gas accommodation alleged the Red Abode and the White House, additionally accustomed as bunkers 1 and 2, amid at Auschwitz 2, while crematoria 2 through 5 were congenital abundant beyond than the Aboriginal, and brash to accomplish the killing alike added efficient. By the summer of 1944, the accumulated accommodation of the crematoria and attainable air incineration pits was 20,000 bodies per day. While affairs for a 6th facility, crematorium 6, were found, it was never built. Alpha in 1942, Jews began to be transported to Auschwitz from all over German animate Europe by rail, accession in circadian convoys. The abstraction abaft this was to ambit Germany from the barbarous genocide Hitler proposed to apple pie out the Jews and Roma. By accustomed out the analytical killing in an animate territory, the Third Reich hoped to accept a assertive amount of acknowledged adaptability, a back adverse abeyant acknowledged after effects should it lose the war. Thus, Auschwitz became the assumption centermost of the genocide, and all the Reich's affairs focused on authoritative the gas accommodation, and crematoria added able in adjustment to added bound complete Hitler's adverse plan. A railway annex accomplished to crematoria 2 and 3 at Auschwitz 2 began architectonics that May, as did a new all-encompassing access bond sectors 2 and B2 to accompany the victims after peace to the gas chambers. The bold of death, the abhorrent addition of prisoners for crematoria. On April 29th, the Aboriginal 1,800 Jews from Hungary accustomed at the camp. From May 14th to Aboriginal July 1944, 437,000 Hungarian Jews bisected the pre-war population, were abandoned to Auschwitz at the amount of 12,000 per day for an ample allotment of that period. Due to the access in executions, the crematoria had to be overhauled. Crematoria 2 and 3 accustomed new elevators abutting the stoves to the gas chambers. New grates were installed, and several of the bathrobe apartment and gas accommodation were painted. Burial pits were dug to activity as ample accumulation graves, and the accession became so abundant that prisoners tasked with eliminating traces had to resort to incinerating corpses in open-air pits in accession to the crematoria. Of the 195,000 Jews abandoned to Auschwitz, about 205,000 were registered at the affected and accustomed consecutive numbers. Addition 25,000 were beatific to added camps, and 865,000 were murdered in the gas accommodation anon afterwards their arrival. If we add the non-Jewish victims, we get a amount beyond 900,000 who were murdered afterwards actuality registered. A loft accession at Auschwitz afterwards casual through the adverse access accomplished apparent assignment liberates, prisoners abide an antecedent addition process. Those accounted fit for assignment were beatific to a band on the adapted and accustomed to the camp. They were registered. A cardinal was tattooed on their arm and beatific into the complex. The rest, Those who accustomed absolute weak, old, or artlessly apparent as enemies of the Reich were beatific to the band on the larboard to be a non-gassed. The accumulation alleged for afterlife included about all children, women with adolescent children, the elderly, and others who, aloft a abrupt and brief analysis by an SS doctor, appeared unfit for duty. Virtually any birthmark such as scars, bandages, boils, or a like apparent abscess could be breadth for actuality accounted unfit. The accouchement were affected to airing a join a pole captivated at a assertive height. Those who could fit beneath it were alleged for gassing. Inmates, clumsy to airing or who accustomed at night, were taken to the crematoria in trucks. Contrarily, new arrivals were herded there. Their accoutrements were confiscated and sorted by the inmates in the Canada affluence rooms, and breadth of the affected in breadth B2 that housed 30 billet acclimated as accumulator accessories for looted appurtenances, and was so alleged as a ancestry of Canada. Back Auschwitz inmates believed that country to be a acreage of affluence and abundance. All those alleged for afterlife were beatific to the crematoria, which consisted of a bathrobe room, a gas alcove, and a boiler room. In crematoria 2 and 3, the bathrobe allowance and gas alcove were underground. In crematoria 4 and 5, they were on the arena floor. The bathrobe allowance had numbered hooks on the bank for blind clothes. In crematoria 2, there was additionally an anatomization room. As mentioned at aboriginal glance, the crematoria were places that resembled macabre hospitals, as the victims believed they would abide showers and a fresh activity of deworming or delousing. The victims bare in a bathrobe allowance and entered. The gas alcove through a aperture apparent toilets or disinfections ram, acceptation ablution room. During the consecutive trials, a aloft captive testified article absolute curious, which approved the cold-bloodedness and artful animality of the Nazis. The accent of the signs afflicted depending on who was actually murdered, whether they were Poles, Hungarians, or Russians, appropriately ensuring that no one would doubtable annihilation afore entering the chambers. Some inmates were alike accustomed soap and a towel. By 1944, a gas alcove could authority up to 2,000 people, although in the final moments of the Holocaust, SS Admiral could allegation in as abounding as 3,000. Claret showers, how the gas accommodation work. Zyklon B was delivered to the crematoria by an appropriate SS appointment accustomed as the Hygiene Institute. Afterwards, closing the doors, SS men caked the Zyklon B pellets through vents in the beam or holes in the abandon of the chamber. The victims usually died oral 10 minutes, although Auschwitz accustomed Rudolf Hirsch testified that it took up to 20 minutes. Apropos the beheading process, Lee's annual was begin in 1952. Lannis, a Jewish captive at Auschwitz, who formed as a SA commando and wrote about it. It would be difficult alike to brainstorm that so abounding bodies could fit into such a baby room. Anyone who didn't appetite to go in was tempted or broken to pieces by dogs. They would asphyxiate from abridgment of air oral hours. Afresh, they closed all the doors tightly, and gas was let in through a baby aperture in the roof. There was annihilation added the body's axial could do. So they abandoned, screamed in bitter, abject voices. Others moaned in choir abounding of despair, and still others kept ball. Spasmodically and accurate heart-rending acute wails, and all the while their choir grew weaker and weaker. Because of the abundant crush, bodies fell on top of anniversary added as they died until a abundance of bristles or 6 layers on top of anniversary added formed, all encompassing a acme of 1 meter. Mothers would become paralyzed, sitting on the floor, all embracing their children, and husbands would die embraced. Some bodies formed a amorphous mass. Others were continuing angled over while the aerial allotment from the abdomen up was lying down. Some had angry actually dejected beneath the access of the gas, while others seemed actually fresh, as if they were asleep. Afterwards, the bodies of 2,000 asleep fell on top of anniversary other. Basic a abundance of doom that would mark one of humanity's best abominable eras. The Sonderkommandos sprang into action. They were prisoners in allegation of removing the bodies. Cutting gas masks, they removed the bodies from the chamber, removed the corpses' glasses and dentures, and bald-headed the women's hair. By February 6, 1943, the Reich Ministry of Economics had accustomed 3,000 kilograms of beard from women at Auschwitz and Maidan. The beard was aboriginal bankrupt in a ammoniac solution, broiled on the brick floors of the crematoria, combed, and placed in cardboard bags. It was a fresh beatific to assorted companies to be acclimated in the accomplishment activity of assorted products. An archetype of this macabre convenance occurred at a accomplishment bulb in Bremen and Blumenthal. Breathworkers begin baby bill with Greek belletrist on them. Some of the braids possibly from some of the 50,000 Greek Jews abandoned to Auschwitz in 1943. Aback they absolved the affected in January 1945. The Red Army begins 7,000 kilos of beastly beard and accoutrements attainable for shipping. Aloof afore cremation, the adornment was removed forth with dental assignment and teeth absolute adored medals. Alpha on September 23, 1940. On the orders of Heinrich Himmler, gold was extracted from the teeth of asleep prisoners. The assignment was performed by prisoners who were dentists, and anyone who absent dental assignment could be cremated animate as punishment. The gold was beatific to the SS health account and acclimated by the dentists to amusement SS men and their families. By October 8, 1942, 50 kilos of gold had been calm aloof from removing fillings or caps from teeth beneath a few milligs. By aboriginal 1944, amid 10 and 12 kilo of gold were actuality extracted from the victim's teeth anniversary month. The bodies were eventually austere in adjoining incinerators, and the ashes were either buried, befuddled into the Vistula River, or acclimated as fertilizer. Cartilage charcoal that had not been appropriately austere were arena in board mortars. The King of Death, the adventure of Rudolf Hirsch, commandant of Auschwitz. Rudolf Hirsch was built in 1901 into a German Christian home. His ancestor was absolute austere and an animated Catholic, and he maintained that his son was destined to access the seminary. Afterwards a doubt, adolescent Rudolf would become a priest, or at atomic, that's what his ancestors believed. Later, Hirsch himself would address the afterwards access in his memoirs, I Administrator of Auschwitz. My vocation seemed predetermined, for my ancestor had fabricated the affiance that I would access the religious life. My absolute accomplishments was based on accomplishing that oath. A acutely religious atmosphere reigned in my family. My ancestor was fanatically captivated to the Catholic Church, but adverse to his family's expectations, who prayed that the youngest affiliate of the Hosklin would become a missionary and advice a company accord to people's hearts. Rudolf gradually absent his accepting in the Catholic religion, and his absorption in aggressive activity grew during his adolescence. In 1916, afterwards the afterlife of his ancestor and unbeknownst to his family, Hussey enlisted in the aforementioned regiment in which his ancestor and grandfathering had served. Alpha A aggressive career that would allowance his fate as able-bodied as that of millions added who would die beneath his command. In 1916, adolescent Husse became politically animate Oral Gardrosbach's Freior, a 30,000 able amber shirt-affiliated paramilitary alignment that apparent the alpha of adolescent Adolf Hitler's acceleration to ability in 1923 beneath orders from Martin Bormann, a fresh friar administrator Hirsch, and added associates of the alignment bludgeoned a bounded abecedary to death, assertive that he had accused a affiliate of H's accumulation of demolition adjoin French accumulation lines. Afterwards, the acknowledgement of one of the killers, H was arrested and bedeviled to 10 years in Bastille for actuality the arena leader, while Bormann was abandoned bedeviled to 1 year in prison. Afterwards abandoned 5 years in prison, H was aback. A accustomed absolution was declared in favor of Hitler's followers. Aloft his absolution in 1928, he began animate as the administrator on farms and agronomical complexes and abutting the Artman League, a blazon of German abode that declared the abstention of Saxon claret and which would afterwards be captivated by the Nazi Party. In the Artman League, Hearst met Heinrich Himmler and acknowledgement to that affiliation in 1934. With Adolf Hitler in power, he would accompany the SS. In November of that year, he accustomed at the Dau absorption camp, one of the best barbarous forth with Auschwitz. He began his career. At Dau, Hearst abstrused the SS article apropos the barbarous analysis of prisoners and rose to become aboriginal a better commandant. He was a non-acknowledgement to a better and beatific to Sachsenhausen. He served as a adamant archguard. On April 27, 1940, the Nazis absentively to actualize a new absorption camp, calmly amid several railway lines, authoritative it awful accessible, appropriately was built in Auschwitz-Birkenau, a abode that Oral a few months would become the capital date of one of the bigger genocides in beastly history. A few canicule afterwards, the camp's conception on May 1st, Rudolf Höss accustomed at Auschwitz, but now as Commandant Fourth with a scattering of guards and 30 abyss transferred. From Sachsenhausen, who would be the camp's aboriginal inmates, Auschwitz grew atrociously during 1940, acceptable one of the assumption centers for the abduction of Jews in Europe. But it wasn't until 1941 that the affected adapted from a Bastille into an annihilation center. Rudolf Höss had been absolute and atrocious up to that point, and that wasn't activity to change. The commandant of Auschwitz was accurate in his task. He had been ordered to abate as abounding Jews as possible, and he would do so. In fact, he was the aboriginal to apparatus, the adverse abstraction of gas accommodation bearded as showers, which fabricated it so that prisoners wouldn't apperceive they were walking to their deaths. In fact, for Höss, afterlife by the pesticide Zyklon B was the activity of altruism as it abhorred abandon and shootings. Aback questioned afterwards about these methods, the algid and artful Höss would respond. Technically, it wasn't that difficult. It wouldn't except been difficult to abate alike beyond numbers. The annihilation itself took the atomic time. You could get rid of 2,000 active and bisected an hour, but it was the fire that took all the time. The annihilation was easy. You didn't alike allegation guards to booty them to the chambers. They aloof came in assured to booty showers, and instead of water, we lit adulteration gas. It all went absolute quickly. So atrocious was apprehend by this point that during the Nuremberg trials, a loft actuality accused of killing over 3.5 actor Jews in the gas chambers. The administrator adapted the adjudicator and said it was abandoned 2.5 million. The blow died of starvation or disease. The adverse Höss was methodical. Every day, several trains loaded with 2,000 bodies anniversary accustomed at Auschwitz, and at the entrance, they were disconnected into two groups. Those able to assignment were beatific to the activity camps, and those who were too anemic were beatific anon to the gas chambers. Beneath Husa, Auschwitz became an afterlife factory, so abundant so that it was unviable. Afterwards, the astronomic ovens he ordered congenital to anon baked the corpses that emerged from the baleful Zyklon B showers. In 1944, Rudolf agitated out a huge operation that would buck his own name, Operation Höss, in which 450,000 Hungarian Jews, bisected of the Jewish citizenry of that country, were abandoned to Auschwitz. The mission was actually brutal, and during that year, the gas accommodation asleep some 10,000 bodies per day. The anatomy ovens were on 24 hours a day, and their astronomic columns of smoke could be apparent for afar around. The able killing industry that Höss had installed in the affected was no best acceptable, and an adjustment to backpack out the genocide, accumulation shootings had to be implemented in pits adjoining to the absorption camps. Finally, in 1945, with Germany beneath annoy by the Allies, Rudolf Höss abandoned his SS column affiliated to the absorption camps and managed to abstain abduction by camouflage himself in a Krieg's abyssal uniform. But afterwards the Allies entered Auschwitz, and apparent the abhorrence that had taken abode there, and Höss's affiliation to it all, a coursing began that led to the abduction of the commandant's wife Hedwig. Höss's wife, threatened with accident her absolute family, betrayed her bedmate, and accustomed that he was ambuscade on an acreage abreast Flinnberg. On March 11, 1946, Rudolf Höss, the Auschwitz animal, was captured. Although Höss continued denied captivation in the Holocaust, it was during the Nuremberg trials that he assuredly accustomed his role as an basal actor in the genocide of the Jewish people. Afterwards, a continued time alienated comment. H. said, "I was in command at Auschwitz from May 1, 1940 to December 1, 1943, and I appraisal that at atomic 2,500,000 bodies were murdered and disposed of there by gas and burning. At atomic bisected, a actor added died of Aiken disease, authoritative a absolute of 3 actor dead. This cardinal represents about 70 or 80% of all the bodies who were beatific to Auschwitz as prisoners. Absolute adolescent accouchement butterfingers of assignment were asleep as a bulk of ethical principle. The pride with which this adverse amount, batten these words acquired the guards to exhausted him afterwards interrogation. In November 1947, Rudolf Höss was bedeviled to afterlife by blind Fourth with 20 added Nazi officers. the man who orchestrated the affected annihilation and agitated out Adolf Hitler's best bloodthirsty dream, died blind by the neck, staring into the faces of the survivors he had bootless to kill. The Cemetery Men, the adverse adventure of the Jewish S-Commandos oral the addition process. Aloft entering Auschwitz, the physically fit macho prisoners were afar and did not accompany either of the two curve mentioned above. Instead, they became allotment of a third awful baddest accumulation of prisoners, the S-Commandos, a chat that meant appropriate commandos. As we accept already mentioned, their job was to handle the corpses larboard abaft by the gas chambers. And that is why it is important to burrow into the adventure of these men, who becoming bigger active distance in the absorption camps in barter for some of the affliction jobs in beastly history. This activity was not addition, and those alleged were answerable to do it. Those who resisted were annihilated. In any case, the associates of some of these brigades, annoyed of actuality complicit in these alarming crimes, organized uprisings in which they rebelled, adjoined Nazism, and in some cases managed to escape. I'm not sad because I'm activity to die. I'm sad because I won't be able to booty animus the way I would like. These words were accounting in 1944 by Marcel Najari, one of the few survivors of the Sonderkommandos, at the Auschwitz absorption camp. Najari larboard abaft some memoirs accounting on cardboard about his acquaintance as a S-Commando faced with the achievability of not actual the war. His affidavit was aloof, one of dozens of agonizing adventures that associates of this appropriate assemblage managed to leave hidden underground artlessly because they enjoyed a few added privileges than the blow of the prisoners. The S-Commandos were beatific to altered billet than the accustomed prisoners and enjoyed bigger food. They additionally had autograph materials, could smoke cigarettes, and booty some medicines that had a head been baseborne by German soldiers from the blow of the Jewish prisoners. Furthermore, they tended to animate best than the blow of the inmates and were not commonly victims of approximate and accidental killings due to beatings by the guards. However, they were far from actuality baddest Jews or adequate any added allowances for sympathy. Those alleged for the S-Commando had to be in bigger concrete activity than the blow, as they would be acclimated for affected labor. They were alleged beneath blackmail of afterlife and afterwards above-mentioned apprehension of the tasks they would be performing. They could not debris to backpack out the activity, and the abandoned way to abide was beheading or suicide. Their role was to force the approved prisoners to band naked and align for their access into the gas accommodation afterwards, them apprehensive what accessible them. They afresh had to abstract the bodies bound and efficiently alteration them to the area's breadth the burial machines were located. Once there, they had to audit anniversary body, cut all the women's beard, and abode them in bags. A arresting actuality is that the Germans affected them to attainable the corpses' mouths, and if they begin any gold teeth, they had to abstract them. If the admiral apparent that any of the bodies still independent any valuables, alike the yos, smallest, they would abate the amenable affair on the spot, throwing them animate into the bonfire of the furnaces. Once the bodies were cremated, they had to array through all the ashes and verify that no cartilage bits remained. Otherwise, they had to bulwark them up themselves. Furthermore, anniversary time they emptied a gas chamber, the S-Commandos had to leave it actually apple pie so that the abutting accumulation wouldn't doubtable that afterlife accessible them. Membership in this baddest accumulation wasn't permanent. The associates of this appropriate commando were advised bearers of secrets, and although they were abandoned from the blow of the prisoners afterwards, about 3 months of confined as S-Commandos, they were beatific to the gas accommodation and afterwards replaced by new inmates. Some of these baddest prisoners captivated. Their positions for added than a year abandoned because they bedeviled the accomplishment that was altered from the boilerplate prisoner. According to some sources, it is estimated that there were 14 ancestors of Sonderkommando. While the exact cardinal of Jews who alternate in this assemblage is unknown. During 1943, 300 bodies were allotment of this appropriate army at Auschwitz alone, and by the end of the war, abandoned 100 survived. Of course, this activity was far from affable for the alleged captives who were usually bedeviled by an abysmal faculty of guilt. For abounding years, they were labeled as collaborators, although it afterwards became bright that they had no alternative. According to historian Gideon Grarieff, it was the advised accommodation by the Germans to use them. They additionally capital The Jews to allotment the blame. This is an absolute atrocious idea. They capital to abolish the acumen amid bent and victim. However, there were some cases in which the Sonderkommando attempted to rebel. On August 2, 1943, at the Treblinka camp, they blanketed about 25 rifles, 20 Duke grenades, and dozens of pistols. Anon afterward, about 700 Jews confronted the guards, causing ample fires in the area. Armed with weapons and all-inclusive experience, the Nazi troops managed to abrogate them, but 100 of them managed to escape the affected and 70 survived the war. Addition case occurred in October 1944 at Auschwitz. Hundreds of associates of the Sonderkommando attacked the Nazi leaders with 2 apparatus guns, axes, knives, and grenades they had managed to abduct from the accumulator facilities. However, this insurgence was bootless, as added then 450 participants were asleep by the SS. Finally, we will focus on Shlomo's testimony. Venetia, a survivor who alternate in the Sonderkommando, accustomed in an interview, "It's as if the assignment I had to do there didn't arise from oral me. You never actually leave the crematorium." At the aforementioned time, abashed by what he accomplished during the Holocaust, he aggregated a catechism he agitated with him until the day he died. What's the point of a little added bread, rest, or accoutrement aback you accept your easily in afterlife every day? Collateral damage, the day the Allies about austere Auschwitz. In the bounce of 1944, the Allied armament accustomed to alternation of advancing intelligence letters anecdotic assorted. Atrocities inflicted on Jews by Adolf Hitler's officers. These abstracts placed accurate accent on the Auschwitz-Birkenau absorption affected inanimate Poland, which they declared as a abode of innumerable horrors. This sparked agitation amid the leaders of the Western abhorrent, who wondered whether they should bomb Auschwitz to abort a key adversary ambition, admitting the accident of murdering hundreds of accoutrements of innocent people. These facts were hidden until the backward 1970s, as the United States had consistently denied ability of the accurate bearings of the Jewish bodies in animate Europe. However, the agitation over the bombing of Auschwitz paved the way for historians who assuredly apparent abstracts about the annihilation camps dating back to 1941, which accomplish it bright, that the actuality of these macabre prisons Irish AI moral bind for the Allies' affairs of action. There is a little accustomed actuality about Apple War II, accompanying to the actuality of the absorption camps and their accessible at the Auschwitz absorption camp. Najari Larbord abaft some memoirs accounting on cardboard about his acquaintance as a S-commando faced with the achievability of not actual the war. His affidavit was aloof one of dozens of agonizing adventures that associates of this appropriate assemblage managed to leave hidden underground artlessly because they enjoyed a few added privileges than the blow of the prisoners. The S-commandos were beatific to altered billet than the accustomed prisoners and enjoyed bigger food. They additionally had autograph materials, could smoke cigarettes, and booty some medicines that had a head been baseborne by German soldiers from the blow of the Jewish prisoners. Furthermore, they tended to animate best than the blow of the inmates and were not commonly victims of approximate and accidental killings due to beatings by the guards. However, they were far from actuality baddest Jews or adequate any added allowances for sympathy. Those alleged for the S-commando had to be in bigger concrete activity than the blow, as they would be acclimated for affected labor. They were alleged beneath blackmail of afterlife and afterwards above-mentioned apprehension of the tasks they would be performing. They could not debris to backpack out the activity, and the abandoned way to abide was beheading or suicide. Their role was to force the approved prisoners to band naked and align for their access into the gas accommodation. Afterwards, them apprehensive what accessible them. They afresh had to abstract the bodies bound and efficiently alteration them to the area's breadth the burial machines were located. Once there, they had to audit anniversary body, cut all the women's beard, and abode them in bags. A arresting actuality is that the Germans affected them to attainable the corpses' mouths, and if they begin any gold teeth, they had to abstract them. If the admiral apparent that any of the bodies still independent any valuables, alike the eye, smallest they would abate the amenable affair on the spot, throwing them animate into the bonfire of the furnaces. Once the bodies were cremated, they had to array through all the ashes and verify that no cartilage bits remained. Otherwise, they had to bulwark them up themselves. Furthermore, anniversary time they emptied a gas chamber, the S-Commandos had to leave it actually apple pie so that the abutting accumulation wouldn't doubtable that afterlife accessible them. Membership in this baddest accumulation wasn't permanent. The associates of this appropriate commando were advised bearers of secrets. And although they were abandoned from the blow of the prisoners afterwards, about 3 months of confined as S-Commandos, they were beatific to the gas accommodation and afterwards replaced by new inmates. Some of these baddest prisoners captivated. Their positions for added than a year abandoned because they bedeviled a accomplishment that was altered from the boilerplate prisoner. According to some sources, it is estimated that there were 14 ancestors of Sonderkommando, while the exact cardinal of Jews who alternate in this assemblage is unknown. During 1943, 300 bodies were allotment of this appropriate army at Auschwitz alone, and by the end of the war, abandoned 100 survived. Of course, this activity was far from affable for the alleged captives who were usually bedeviled by an abysmal faculty of guilt. For abounding years they were labeled as collaborators, although it afterwards became bright that they had no alternative. According to historian Gideon Grariefi, it was advised accommodation by the Germans to use them. They additionally capital the Jews to allotment the blame. This is an absolute atrocious idea. They capital to abolish the acumen amid bent and victim. However, there were some cases in which the Sonderkommando attempted to rebel. On August 2, 1943, at the Treblinka camp, they blanket about 25 rifles, 20 Duke grenades, and dozens of pistols. Anon afterward, about 700 Jews confronted the guards, causing ample fires in the area. Armed with weapons and all-inclusive experience, the Nazi troops managed to abrogate them. But 100 of them managed to escape the affected, and 70 survived the war. Addition case occurred in October 1944 at Auschwitz. Hundreds of associates of the SA-Kommando attacked the Nazi leaders with 2 apparatus guns, axes, knives and grenades they had managed to abduct from the accumulator facilities. However, this insurgence was bootless as added than 450 participants were asleep by the SS. Finally, we will focus on Shlomo's testimony. Venezia, a survivor who alternate in the Sonderkommando, accustomed in an interview, "It's as if the assignment I had to do there didn't arise from oral me. You never actually leave the crematorium." At the aforementioned time, abashed by what he accomplished during the Holocaust, he aggregate a catechism he agitated with him until the day he died. What's the point of a little added bread, rest, or accoutrement aback you accept your easily in afterlife every day? Collateral damage. The day the Allies about austere Auschwitz. In the bounce of 1944, the Allied armament accustomed to alternation of advancing intelligence letters, anecdotic assorted. Atrocities inflicted on Jews by Adolf Hitler's officers. These abstracts placed accurate accent on the Auschwitz-Birkenau absorption affected in animate Poland, which they declared as the abode of innumerable horrors. This sparked agitation amid the leaders of the Western abhorrent who wondered whether they should bomb Auschwitz to abort a key adversary ambition, admitting the accident of murdering hundreds of accoutrements of innocent people. These facts were hidden until the backward 1970s, as the United States had consistently denied ability of the accurate bearings of the Jewish bodies in animate Europe. However, the agitation over the bombing of Auschwitz paved the way for historians who assuredly apparent abstracts about the annihilation camps dating back to 1941, which accomplish it bright that the actuality of these macabre prisons erish a moral bind for the Allies' affairs of action. There is a little accustomed actuality about Apple War II accompanying to the actuality of the absorption camps and their accessible, accepting by the Allies, abnormally the United States and the United Kingdom. Although denied for decades, these countries knew the accuracy about the genocide in Europe. If you're apprehensive why they didn't act on it, the acknowledgement is that it put them at a political disadvantage. But let's alpha from the beginning. The final band-aid to the Jewish problem, as Hitler alleged it, was to systematically abate all bodies associated with Jewish origins. To accomplish this, he acclimated ample accessories such as attainable air prisons breadth. Jews were affected to work, bound up, tortured, acclimated as guinea pigs for macabre experiments, and accomplished on accumulation application assorted. Accessories such as the alarming gas chambers. Probably the best abominable of these camps was Auschwitz-Birkenau, created beneath the administration of Heinrich Himmler, directed by the SS, and which came to abode up to 400,000 bodies in the affliction. Atrocious distance, including overcrowding, famine, bottleneck, and disease. To abstain all-embracing condemnation, Adolf Hitler additionally created a affected agnate to a ghetto. That is, a affectionate of adjacency breadth Jews lived in poor conditions, but which was far from the abhorrence and annihilation that reigned. In the rest, Teretian was a prison, but fabricated up to at atomic arise habitable. The aphotic motive abaft this was that Goebbels, the Nazi advertising minister, accessed the Red Cross about the facilities, appropriately assuming a beneath barbarous angel of the world. This created an adaptation of Apple War II, in which the Allies knew about the actuality of ample captive of war camps, but at the aforementioned time were blind of the atrocities accomplished by the Nazis. However, this is not the accurate story. The accuracy is that by 1941, aback the Holocaust took the anatomy it would beforehand until the end of the war. The British were already acquainted of the Führer's plans. The United Kingdom had intercepted dozens of letters from SS Admiral and soldiers discussing captive transports, affected activity, and annihilation camps, amid added elements that accustomed British intelligence to affix the dots. Abstracts proving that the United States additionally knew about these affairs date aback to its access into the war in 1942. The aboriginal agitation surrounding Auschwitz arose over whether the Allies should animate publicity about the horrors in Nazi Germany. The general's acknowledgement was no. The acumen abundant of the American and British accessible was additionally anti-Semitic, and the rulers feared that accessible assessment adjoined the United States activity in Europe would be abrogating if they believed it was an aggressive move to avert the Jews. The soldiers deployed in Europe, for the best part, had no bright ability of the torture, gas chambers, and added atrocities suffered by Jews, gypsies, and added indigenous groups. Nor were they absorbed in animate aback. The Allies' primary focus was on awkward Hitler's territorial beforehand, rather than analytic his ideal of the Aryan race. The additional above agitation came in 1944, aback the Allies afterwards advancing. On the western advanced and all-encompassing the gates of Poland advised bombing the Auschwitz Bastille affected which, at that time was at its Iguil apartment 200,000 Jews and addition 200,000 political prisoners, both Polish and Soviet. Farben constructed ammunition bulb amid in the Monowitz circuitous additionally accustomed as Auschwitz II, breadth tens of accoutrements of Jewish disciplinarian were working. Destroying this branch was of absolute absorption to the United States as Germany was adversity from ammunition shortages, and this would added accident Hitler's activity primarily by depriving him of the agency to resupply the Panzer and the Luftwaffe. But the operation would be acutely difficult. On April 4th, the Americans agitated out intelligence flights in which they took aeriform photographs of the three camps to actuate an able plan of action, although the analysts who formed on these images were actually blind that they were celebratory. A captive of war camp. Abounding years later, this accommodation by the American authorities would be awful questioned, and there are versions that assure that the superiors were additionally blind of the bearings, while added historians adduce that the advice was advisedly hidden from them so that the consistent activity would not be beyond by the abhorrence of killing innocents. On April 7th, 2 Polish prisoners managed to escape from Auschwitz and gave a first-year-hand annual to the Arch of the American War Refugee Table, in which they abundant the cartography of the affected and told about the horrors that were accomplished there, such as torture, gas chambers, behemoths, crematoriums. However, this did not affect the American affairs to bomb IG Farben. On June 26, 71, B-17 abundant bombers aerial breastwork aircraft flew at low distance afterwards the railway beforehand accomplished to Auschwitz. Although they did not backpack out any attacks, the ambition of this movement was to actuate the Nazis' acknowledgement time. A back addition plan proposed by the U.S. Air Force was to abort the railway curve that transported ammunition from Auschwitz, appropriately eliminating accumulation lines. 2 months afterwards, in August, the accommodation was assuredly fabricated to beforehand some barrio on the outskirts of Auschwitz. The extreme IG Farben bulb amid about 5 kilometers from Monowitz was austere 4 times. Explosives were additionally alone on areas abreast Birkenau, including a German hospital. But admitting all these abandoned attacks, the Americans never dared to absolve the administration of bombs on Auschwitz. Abaft the aggressive decisions there were abounding political and moral debates about the attainable after-effects of adverse a Bastille affected with hundreds of accoutrements of innocent bodies inside. Through these discussions, war refugee advocates as able-bodied as Jewish Assembly in North America and Abundant Britain succeeded in awkward a plan that would accept beggared the Third Reich of fuel, but at an absolute aerial cost. Abounding. Stop. The afterlife marches and the liberation of Auschwitz. By the end of the war, the Germans were in crisis mode. The Red Army was advancing atrociously forth the Eastern Front, and the crimes committed in Poland were too grave for the Allies to uncover. If they got there easily on the active prisoners or the absorption camps, the Nazis would lose added than the war. The aftermost accumulation transports to access at Auschwitz were 60,000 to 70,000 Jews from the Łódź ghetto, about 2,000 from Terezin, and 8,000 from Slovakia. The final edition took abode on October 30th, 1944, and on November 1st or 2nd, 1944, Heinrich Himmler ordered the SS to stop accumulation gassing. On November 25th, he ordered the abolition of the gas accommodation and crematoria at Auschwitz. The Sonderkommando and added prisoners began the assignment of dismantling the barrio and allowance the site. On January 18, 1945, Engelbert Marich, a German Bent transferred from Mauthausen, became the aftermost captive assigned a consecutive cardinal at Auschwitz, Cardinal 22,499. The Nazis were in a chase adjoined time to annihilate affirmation of the Holocaust. According to Polish historian Andrzej Szylki, the aborticide of the affected was one of its best adverse chapters, if such a affair can be measured. Himmler ordered the aborticide of all camps in January 1945, cogent the commanders, "The Führer holds you abandoned amenable for ensuring that no absorption affected captive avalanche animate into adversary hands." The looted appurtenances from the Canada billet forth with architecture abstracts were transported abysmal into Germany. Amid December 1, 1944 and January 15, 1945, added than one actor items of accoutrement were arranged for addition from Auschwitz. About 95,000 of these bales were beatific to absorption camps in Germany. Alpha on January 17, some 58,000 Auschwitz detainees were abandoned beneath SS guard. Aboriginal branch west on foot, afresh by attainable top bales alternation to absorption camps in Germany and Austria, such as Bergen, Belsen, Bonwald, Dachau, Flossenburg, Grossrohn, Mauthausen, Dora, Mitba, Ravensbrück, and Sachsenhausen. Some 9,000 prisoners were labored abaft at camps the two as they were accounted too ailing or anemic to move. During the afterlife marches, the SS attempt or contrarily accomplished anyone clumsy to continue. Accoutrements of guards followed, carefully abaft the prisoners, killing anyone who chock-full or fell. Peter Longerich estimated that a division of the detainees were asleep by breezy beheading during the all-encompassing walks. By December 1944, some 15,000 Jewish prisoners had accustomed from Auschwitz at Bergen-Belsen. Brett they were absolved by the British on April 15, 1945. On January 20th, crematoria 2 and 3 were absolute up, and on January 23rd, the Canada warehouses were set on fire. According to the accounts, they austere for 5 days. Crematorium. 4 had been partially burst afterwards the Sonderkommando defection in October, and the blow was afterwards destroyed. On January 26th, one day afore the accession of the Red Army, Crematorium 5 was absolute up. At about 9 a.m. on Saturday, January 27, 1945, the Red Army entered the absorption-affected complex. The aboriginal to be absolved was Auschwitz III amid at Monowitz. The 60th Army of the Aboriginal Ukrainian advanced accustomed at Auschwitz I and II about 300 p.m. that aforementioned day. There they begin 7,000 animate prisoners in the 3 capital camps, 500 in the added sub-camps, and added then 600 corpses. The items begin included 837,000 pieces of women's clothing, 370,000 men's suits, 44,000 pairs of shoes, and 7,000 kiljalgers of beastly hair, which the Soviet War Crimes Commission estimated came from 140,000 women. The Convention of Forensic Sciences in KCO advised some of the beard and begin at independent traces of hydrogen cyanide, the capital additive of Zyklon B. Primo Levi, the acclaimed Italian Jewish biographer and Holocaust survivor, declared, "Seeing the Aboriginal 4 soldiers on horseback access Auschwitz 3, breath he had been in the infirmary." According to Levi, the Soviets casting abnormally abashed glances at the sprawled bodies, the ashore barracks, and the few of us who were still alive. They didn't accost us or smile. They seemed afflicted, not abandoned by pity, but by abashed assets that closed their aperture and angry their boring to the burial scene. It was that abashment we knew so well, the one that abashed us afterwards, the selections, and every time we had to attestant or abide to some outrage, the abashment that the Germans didn't apperceive about. The abashment that a aloof man adventures aback faced with the abomination of another. The activity of answerability that such a abomination existed, that it had assuredly entered the apple of absolute things, and that their will to do acceptable had accustomed to anemic or non-existent and had been of no use in arresting themselves. Georgy Elisvetsky, a Soviet soldier who entered one of the barracks, said in 1980 that he heard added soldiers acquaint the inmates, "You are free, comrades." But they didn't respond, so he approved speaking in Russian, Polish, German, and Ukrainian. Afresh, he acclimated some Yiddish, the accent acclimated by Jews of European origin. The anticipation I was afflictive them, and started to hide. And abandoned aback, I told them in Yiddish, "Don't be afraid. I am a colonel in the Soviet army, and a Jew. We accept a rise to chargeless you." Finally, as if the barrier had collapsed, they ran agreeable to join us, knelt down, kissed the lapels of our coats, and hugged us. The Soviet aggressive medical account and the Polish Red Cross accustomed acreage hospitals that cared for 4,500 prisoners' adversity from the furnishings of starvation, such as diarrhea and tuberculosis, with abetment from bounded volunteers, who helped until the Red Cross aggregation accustomed from KCO in Aboriginal February. At Auschwitz, too, layers of clay on the banter floors had to be aching off with shovels. Baptize was acquired from snow and blaze pits. A 4 added aid arrived. 2,200 patients were cared for by a few doctors and 12 Polish Red Cross nurses. All patients were afterwards transferred to the brick barrio at Auschwitz 1. Several blocks were adapted into a hospital with medical agents animate 18-hour shifts. The liberation of Auschwitz accustomed little columnist absorption at the time. The Red Army was focused on its beforehand into Germany, and the liberation of the affected had not been one of its primary objectives. Boris Pahlavi appeared on the Liberation in Pravda on the 2nd of February 1945, but fabricated no acknowledgement of the Jews, and the inmates were collectively declared as victims of fascism. It was not until the accession of the Western Allies at Buchenwald, Bergen, Belsen, and Dachau in April 1945 that the liberation of the camps accustomed boundless coverage, autograph, an enduring folio in the accepted history of horror.